the other thing is, you know, the 6 degrees of separation, or if you talk to someone in the world, everybody, well, in Indian country, it's 1.5 degrees of separation. So I wrote to Lee and I said, well, I'm really glad to see you at Harvard, and my son was there and active in Lenape, and that was so very important to him. And he writes back, oh yes, Tom. And I hadn't told him my son's name. So once again, we have the 1.5 degrees of separation. So I'm just very pleased to have you here tonight. And thank you so much for coming, and thank all of you for being here.
Oh, that's me. Well, good evening. Thank you for that kind introduction, Anne. I'd like to begin by introducing myself in Navajo. Yadé Shi'e Li Bitsóí Kia Ani Shlido Shishi Bashishin Jimmy Vishiche Nahobani Bashina. So in Navajo tradition, to establish kinship ties with you all. I told you what my plans are, maternal and paternal as well. In case there are other Navajos in the room, we can also talk about how we are related offline. But I'd like to begin with a story. About, was it 3 years ago, I think, that the platypus's genome was sequenced. And it was in the news, and I happened to be at home at that time. And we were sitting around a dinner table celebrating a birthday or some sort of joyous occasion. And one of my uncles happened to be there. And he's a traditional healer. And so I think it flashed across the television screen. So he saw the platypus. And he asked, what is that? And I said, well, it's found in Australia. It's a mammal, but it has a duck bill and it has claws. He says, well, that's kind of odd. Well, why is it in the news? And I said, well, they just found out all the information they need to know about it. And so what did they find out? And of course, this conversation is taking place in Navajo. So I'm trying to, I was trying really hard to explain science and technology and translating it into Navajo, bioinformatics, genomics, genome sequencing, and all of these technical terms. And so he said, so what did they find out? I said, well, it turns out that the platypus shares the same genes as the chicken and the cow and humans. I said, well, that's really interesting. So you're saying that we have something in common? I said, yeah, we pretty much do. So he says, what do the scientists have to say about all this? And I said, well, and again, I'm trying to explain it in terms that he'll understand, but still trying to remain technical. And he sat there like this with his eyes closed, and he's listening to me the whole time. And I said, well, the bottom line is, we're pretty much more alike than we are different. So it kind of goes along the same lines as we are all related. And that's how we identify in Native American cultures. So when I told him that, and there was a pause, and he opened his eyes and he looked at me. And I said, what do you think about that? He said, well, I'm really glad that those white scientists finally figured out what we already knew. So, and then that just brought me back down to earth, and I said, okay, I'll go for that. So, but on that note, I really came into bioinformatics and genomics. It was a rather circuitous route. I started out in engineering as an undergraduate, and then I got to differential equations, and after I finished the course, I sat there and wondered, what does this have to do with anything in my world at home? And at the time, I was very close to my family. And so I took a break. I drove to Brooklyn for a year, actually 2 years. And then I transferred to the University of New Mexico and decided to pursue student services. And I wanted to help students who were questioning what their career pathways were going to be, what they should study, and the like. And so I happened to come upon a job at a community college as a financial aid. But I knew that if I needed to move up to the next level, I'd have to have a master's degree. So I applied to Harvard. I got admitted to the vet school there. I finished my master's. And then I decided to remain on the East Coast, and this was 13 years ago. And I got a job at Dartmouth. And I worked there for 2 years in admissions and recruitment. And I was asked to come back to be a program coordinator at Harvard, at the Native American program. So I worked there for about 3.5 years. And then through the Harvard network and colleagues there, I had a friend and a colleague who asked me to apply for this director of minority training in bioinformatics and genomics. I said, I don't have that kind of training. And she said, well, I know the PI. He's interested in someone who has a really strong track record in recruiting underrepresented minority students. I said, sure. She brokered a meeting. I met with the PI. We hit it off. And a few months later, he offered me the position. And so, first of all, you have to understand, I'm not trained as a geneticist or anything in the genome sciences. He said, that's fine. I said, I also don't have a doctorate. He said, no, we can work around those issues. What I want you to do is establish this training program with all of these other institutions around the country, minority-serving institutions, and let's develop pipelines and bring in students who are interested in bioinformatics and genomics. So I said, okay. I think I can do it. So 5 years later, we had a very successful training program. We worked with HBCUs, HSIs, and Hispanic serving institutions, but also tribal colleges and universities. And then I also developed an interest in ELSI at that point. And ELSI is an acronym for Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of Genetic Research. And as I became interested in this area, I realized that there was a way for me to move into that research area without having a doctorate in the biological sciences. So then this is where Penn came into the picture. And as I told Wendy earlier, it was about 10 years ago, I was at a conference in Boston, and the exec doc program had a booth there. And I talked to the recruiters, and they said, well, you have to have a certain level of experience, and if you've been advancing in your career, and there's all these different characteristics or variables that we consider. And at the time, I felt like I probably wouldn't be admitted. So I waited until 2005. And at that point, my PI was very supportive, and so I pursued it. And that's why I was never really on campus, but I was a part of the Penn community. And even though my time was limited here, I tried as much as I could to become involved. Those 2.5 years went by really, really quickly. And I didn't have much of a life because I was working full-time and writing my dissertation. But it was, when I think about it now, when I walk on the campus today, I realized that I hadn't been back since graduation. And when I heard about the Penn Spectrum event, I was excited about that. But how am I going to do this? How am I going to go? Because I have to be at the SACNIS conference in LA. And SACNIS is the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. And I've been very active with that organization, as well as ACES, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. I'm a member of 2 different committees with both organizations. And so I knew that I had already committed to going to SACNIS. And then a few weeks ago, I was contacted. And I said, well, I think I can do it. Who do you need to know? Well, this afternoon. And so I said, okay, let me see if I can rearrange my schedule. And fortunately, I was able to. And so I caught the red eye last night, arrived this morning. And fortunately, my room was available. And I came in for just to hear President Gutman speak. And just to hear the panel, what has happened in the past and where Penn is at now. It's really exciting to hear about these new developments and how Anna is expanding and growing. And I talked to Bob about Native American Studies and the lead for Native American Support Services. And I always had that hat on because I'm trained in student affairs. But I also have an interest, again, in ELSI, but also with, I'm also on different committees, national committees, regarding minority male achievement. And we know that across the board that more females are graduating from college than there are males. But for the Native American community, that number is almost 2/3 female. And so the issue here is not that more females are graduating, is that not enough Native men are pursuing higher education, and they aren't graduating. So we talked a little bit about, okay, you can recruit a critical mass, but if you can't support them on campus, how do you expect them to be successful? And so those are some of the challenges that I see that Penn faces now. And as we're growing the numbers with our Native American community, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I would be willing to be part of that. So I'd like to assist as much as I can. So back to genomics and bioinformatics. So these are questions that I'm always asked. So what's it all about? Why is it relevant to us? The best way that I could describe genomics is that it's really the study of the complete genome of living organisms. Anything that's alive is now being sequenced. And bioinformatics, well, it's really the study of combining biology, computer science, and biotechnology to help us understand genome sequences. Okay, I don't know if that's clear. That's the best that I can do without having to go into a lot of technical knowledge, or language, excuse me. And so in my work, I discovered that, again, Native Americans are not always invited to the table, so to speak. In fact, there was a comment that was made at the SACNAS conference by one of the presenters who talked about the HatMap project. And that's the international human genome project of collecting DNA samples from around the world to figure out basically migration patterns. So the presenter made a comment along the lines of, so when the Native Americans opted out of this study, they really did a disservice to themselves. So I sat there, and I actually sat on my hands because I was like ready to stand up and counter with my own comments and my opinion. But he went on to say, and it's a disservice because now Native Americans are part of a lot of these research studies, and they should be. Because I'm not saying that, I'm sure there are reasons why that they opted out, but they need to be part of this discussion. So I raised my hand, and I said, well, thank you for that comment, and yes, I agree, it is a disservice to the Native American community. However, you have to understand that there are so many different layers that are involved with genome sequencing and genome studies and genetic studies. You have to take into account culture and language and oral history. I said, just because we don't have our history written down doesn't necessarily mean that we don't know where we come from. And that was part of the National Geographic project. So to my relatives up in the north, they were approached, and one of the comments that one of the community members there up in Alaska made was, the researchers came and said, okay, well, this is what we want to do for you. And so can you give us your DNA sample? And then we can tell you where you came from. So this elder said, well, I didn't ask you for your help. 2, I already know where I come from, but I can tell you where you can go. So it was just really funny to hear that. And it reminded me of, I'm Navajo, so it reminded me of my origin stories. And so we believe that we were all created in the Southwest, everyone. And then from there, everyone dispersed. And so everyone has their roots somewhere within the four sacred mountains of Navajo land, but it's very similar to the origin stories of all Native people throughout the Americas. I know that a lot of the Native people here on the East Coast refer to themselves as the people of the land, or the people of the East, or the people of the East, and things of that nature. And so there are similarities there. And so I can understand how, and I explained to him that having these type of migration studies can be a threat to Native cultures and Native identity, Native language, and Native land comes. Because who's to say if Native people no longer speak the languages? Who's to say, okay, well, you're no longer distinct, because you don't have a distinct language, you don't have a distinct culture. You're just like everybody else. So therefore, you don't really have any claims or ties to the land. So therefore, that can be taken away from us. So there's a threat there. So I explained that to this gentleman, and he understood, and other people agreed. And so that's how I want to have an impact on the ELSU side of genomics and bioinformatics. Because to me it's important for non-Native people to understand how we are tied to the land, and how it's part of our culture, and how it's part of our language. And so it also reminds me of another story with my mother. And she told me about what science was about from a Native perspective, even though she didn't call it science. And I would ask her, well, why are things the way that they are? She said, it just is. It's just that way. And was like, just accept it. But now when I think back about it, I grew up around science because she was an ethnobotanist. She weaves rugs. She tends her own wool, takes care of it. She dyes it. She seeks out plants. And growing up, I spent a lot of time with her because she was a single parent. And so she would point out plants to me and say, okay, this is for this color, and this is for another color. You can eat this one, but you can't eat that one. And this is also, this can be used as a medicine, and this is edible, and this can be a spice, and you can just eat this right off of the ground. And so it was really interesting. Now that I look back on my upbringing, how I was surrounded by science, and she could predict weather by looking at the stars and the moon, and she'd say, okay, it's going to rain tomorrow, it's going to be cloudy, and it's going to rain probably in the afternoon. How do you know that? She says, well, you just look at the stars. And so there was cosmology there. And then she was also, I guess, my first A&P teacher, because every time there's a celebration at home, we butcher a lamb. So when that happens, I always try to assist, and then she'll point out different parts of the anatomy of the sheep. And I didn't think about it until now. Wow, that was probably one of my first lessons in A&P and biology. And so all that to say, working with white scientists can be challenging. A lot of times I'm asked, so why is it that natives are so anti-science? I said, we're not. We grew up around science. And I'll give them some examples about how I grew up with science. And I said, at the end, though, we've been prodded, we've been poked, we've been experimented upon. There's a whole, the litany of atrocities that have occurred, including the forced sterilization of American men and women in the 70s. And most recently, the case of the Havasupai that were exploited. I'll get back to that in a little bit. But I explained to him why we're wary, why we're cautious. And this has happened with other communities of color as well, particularly the Tuskegee experiment. And that's really sad. And I don't know if you've read the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And it's about this black woman who had cervical cancer, and those cancer cells were taken from her, even though they say she signed the consent form. But years later, those cells are still in production. And that woman never received compensation, neither did her descendants. And so, giving these examples to the scientific community helps them to understand that, okay, all right, that's the context. So, but why are you still anti-science? Well, okay, we're now training our own. We're now, we have researchers, we have scientists, we have lawyers, we have educators, we have doctors, just across the board. Well, now we want to conduct these studies on our own terms. So we want to find solutions to diseases, to illnesses that are affecting our communities. But again, we want it on our terms. So I said, think of it this way. It's not so much that it's anti-science, but it's pro-indigenous. It's from our perspective. It's what we want for our people and how we can help our people. And so sometimes the light bulb does go off for some of them. They say, wow, that's very novel. No, it's just, think about it. That's the perspective that they've had for so long. It's always the mentality of, what can we do for you? Here's how we can help you. Let us save you. And it's like, well, save us from what? What? Let's figure out what we want to do and where we want to go. And so, all that to say, my interest now is really to protect indigenous communities from being exploited. And I don't know how much you know about the Havasupai case, but the Havasupai lived in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And Arizona State University reached out to them several years ago and wanted to conduct a diabetes study. And the Havasupai said, yes, we want your help. How can you help us? So they conducted this study. We found out a lot of valuable information for the tribe. That information was exchanged. But then several years later, or a few years later, one of the tribal members came across a study that was still utilizing specimens and blood samples from the tribe for schizophrenia, for inbreeding, and for migration patterns. And so the Havasupai sued Arizona State. And we went to court, went back and forth. I think it was finally in 2008, I believe here, that the courts ruled in favor of the Havasupai. Yes, in fact, it was April of this year that the court ruled in favor of the tribe and agreed to pay $700,000 to 41 members of the Havasupai. And so that is indeed a victory, even though there's not a lot of legal precedent because there's still issues of informed consent, from individual consent to group consent. So let's say I agreed to have my genome sequenced through the lab that I work for now, George Church's lab. He's part of this personal genome project. And what if they found out all this information that I didn't necessarily need to know? But could they use that information and generalize for the entire Navajo population? And so there's the danger of that. And so even, so what is genomics really going to do for us now? Individually, it allows for personalized healthcare. And it gives us more information, probably more than we need to know. Because if I found out that I was susceptible to certain chronic illnesses or diseases, would I continue to eat the way that I do? Would I continue to exercise the way that I do? Or would I stop? Or would I improve it? And what if none of these things ever really happen? So there's a lot of interesting questions that are out there now. But I think the real benefit for genome sequencing, for for us as Native people is that it'll help us to find answers to, say, diabetes, or obesity, or alcoholism, or things that really are affecting our communities. So that's the benefit that I see. But it's also a challenge to work with tribal communities and tribal nations, because a lot of these nations don't have institutional review board mechanisms to protect them. So that's sort of what I'm working on now. And while I was at Georgetown for a year, I worked on this research project involving indigenous communities. Now that I'm back at Harvard, my job is more administrative. The majority of it is administrative. But a certain percentage I've been granted permission to pursue policy research. And so that's where I'm at now. And so all that to say, those 3 letters at the end of my name from Penn mean a lot. And they have really allowed me to, the doctorate has really allowed me to pursue research studies that I wouldn't have been able to pursue if I didn't have a doctorate. But now that I do, I can be a TI. I can apply for federal grants. I can be an independent researcher, and I actually work as a consultant at tribal colleges and universities. So that's what Penn has done for me. And that's basically what I wanted to share with you. And Anne asked me earlier, so what are you going to talk about?
So did Cindy.
And I figured, well, you know, I figured since I wasn't given a topic, I figured it's going to be open. And I wanted to share part of my life story and my career pathway, my educational experience, and what Penn has done for me, and where it's going to lead me into the future. So I wanted to share that much with you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's great to make new connections, and to come back to Penn has been great. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions?
Actually, I have a question. Sure. So when we talk about generalizability beyond individuals, you said it can be more than that. I think the part of for yourself is that generalizable to the Navajo. But when we talk about studies about diabetes, if they're studying, say, Navajo, is it generalizable to Mi'kmaq, for example, who are up in the northeastern corner of Canada? So how generalizable is it beyond particular tribes or particular communities?
Well, we can step back and talk a little bit about how there are some companies that are springing up now. I think one of them is Ancestry.com, where you can submit your DNA and figure out what your ancestry is. Well, there are certain genetic markers to mitochondria that will determine if you're Native American or not, if you have that Native American gene. But the problem, the issue here is that, yes, you may have that, but you can't really generalize in that way from the Navajo to this group in Canada, because part of it is the environment, but it's also part of culture, and also tradition and beliefs, and it goes into diet. So there are ways in which people can generalize, I think regionally, but not from the Navajo or the Southwest into Canada. So there are ways in which studies can be conducted that might cite similarities, but I don't think that it's possible to generalize between groups because they're so distinct. Even though we both identify as Native American or American.
So on a related topic to that, I mean, it's really interesting that this is coming along at a time where, so I mean, some background on myself. I background in Shawnee, but I grew up in Duwamish country up in the Northwest in Seattle, and they have this interesting problem where, I think that, I don't know how to say it, I guess, really, but they are having difficulty showing that they are, distinct people because they no longer have preserved like a language, and a lot of people have just become, integrated with life there, and so they're struggling there to get, recognition, and this is coming at the same time that I'm wondering, like, whether you have experience that people are taking, these genetic tests and finding out that they have, ancestry as Native American and coming and then kind of like latching on to that identification, and like in your experience have they been coming to you and saying like, I just found out and I have Native American ancestry, and has that been happening with students or people?
Well, this is where it becomes somewhat touchy, especially in college admissions and for scholarship purposes, because people will self-identify as Native American or American Indian. I use the terms interchangeably, even though I prefer American Indian because there's political history behind that term. I've seen it because I've worked in admissions, and for example, at Dartmouth, when anyone self-identified as Native American, we sent a follow-up sheet, a questionnaire, just to ask for additional information. Okay, so which tribe are you enrolled in? If you are enrolled, if not, which community do you identify with? Is there a BIA agency that you have access to? And how do you fit into your Native American community? And things along those lines. And some people have come back and have said, oh, well, I just heard that I might be, but I really don't know, so never mind. But I know students, I know one person who applied to Harvard Law School, wasn't admitted, claimed to have conducted a genealogy search of some sort, found out he was, I forget which tribe it was, and so then he reapplied, tailored his application to appear as Native American, and then he was admitted. And he shared this story with me. I was shocked, and I said, okay, so last year when you applied, you weren't Native American, but this year you applied, and now you are. So there are those issues. And I think that for communities that don't necessarily have federal recognition, and that's a problem throughout the U.S., and now that people are re-identifying, because there was a time when people were ashamed because we were discriminated against, and to a certain extent we're still being discriminated against. So a lot of these communities throughout the U.S. are taking ownership of their identity, and but it is a challenge for them to gain federal recognition, even though. Does the federal government really have a right to say a group of Native people is Native or not? But then the issue there is also it's political, because it comes down to federal funding and things of that nature, even from at the state level, even the local level. So all that to say, I think that we should take ownership of our identity, but then there are people who are going to abuse it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess I just find it really interesting that it's like in some ways very easy for an individual now to kind of come out and like, assert this identity, but it's still very hard for some tribes and some groups that have been kind of together for all this time. And still, can't. It's still not any easier for them. So.
Well, I agree. And having moved, growing up in a traditional home, and then coming to the East Coast and interacting with other Native people who are really clinging to what they know and trying to reestablish themselves. And that means a lot to me because the sincerity is there. They're trying to reestablish themselves. And so I try to help as much as I can. And right now I'm on the board of directors for the North American Indian Center of Boston. And that's an intertribal organization. And anytime you get more than 2 or 3 tribes together, you know that there's going to be all sorts of interesting conversations taking place. Any other questions?
Sort of a question. I'm actually from Alaska, and I know that we have a pretty extensive research approval IRB process in place pretty much across Alaska. You were talking about tribal IRB and how not enough groups have them. How do we provide that education and outreach, I guess, to groups like that would like to participate in research but need to have a body to prove or protect their group?
I think one of the best agencies that can allow for this type of outreach is probably through the Indian Health Service. And I think if there was funding available, and if there were researchers who were willing to undertake something like this, I think that it would be huge. Because there are communities, and I don't know how the IRB process for Alaska Native corporations evolved, how they're in place now, but that might be a model, and use that. I know with the Navajo Nation we have an IRB process. It's pretty extensive. It actually has 12 steps. But it's very extensive and they're very thorough. But right now, they have the IRB for the Navajo Nation has a moratorium on any sort of genetic research studies until everyone, well, not necessarily everyone, but most everyone at the governmental level and also the citizenry, but more importantly through the Navajo Medicine Men's Association, as long as everyone's on the same page to understand the risks and the benefits of such studies, then the Navajo Nation will move forward. But some communities don't even have that in place. And there's a lot of companies now, biotech companies that are coming up that are seeking out homogeneous tribal communities because of the homogeneity of these groups. And that's happening around the world. Indigenous people are being exploited. Again, but to answer your question, I think the best way probably, or the best agency would probably be the Indian Health Service.
Any questions? Thank you very much.